Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. It's 2:05, so I think we can get started. Thanks very much to Murray Leibbrandt, Nicola Branson, and Emma Whitelaw for offering to redo the presentation, the opening keynote that they did at the Siyaphumelela conference at the end of June. And it's on catalyzing social mobility through student success. A little bit of a brief background for Murray. Murray holds the National Research Foundation Chair in Poverty and Inequality Research in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. He is the director of the Southern African Labour and Development Research Unit and the African Centre of Excellence for Inequality Research within the African Research Universities Alliance. He is on the executive committee of the International Economic Association and is a senior research fellow of UNU-WIDER. He has published widely in development economics using survey data and especially panel data to analyze South Africa's poverty, inequality, and labor market dynamics. So thank you very much, Prof. I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ashton. And that's all more or less irrelevant. It's a great privilege for myself and Nicola and Emma to be with you today. We had a very, what was for us a very moving and wonderful engagement, literally, with the Siyaphumelela participants at the recent conference. And so it's very nice to come together again and just engage. It's got a slightly different tone because today's presentation is really not just about setting the scene for the Siyaphumelela conference, which it was initially. It's about us engaging over that scene setting, in particular in terms of what it means for the amazing Siyaphumelela community who are trying to make a difference in their institutions through graduation rates, and the context in our country and our inequality and what students come into our institutions, the background within which they come into our institutions, and all that means for their success in the institutions. That's what we can bring to you today, and also then something about the what happens to them on exit from the institutions, where you, the Siyaphumelela community, are the people grinding it out day in and day out, very committed to improving throughput rates, what happens inside the institutions. So that's the basis for our engagement today, and it really is, as I said, very nice to be with you. So the presentation runs as follows. It focuses mostly on what we have to bring to you, leading for you to lead the discussion on what that means for your work. So we'll focus briefly on the texture of our inequality and our lack of social mobility in the country, or our failure, really, and then to highlight the importance of post-school attainment for this mobility. If we're going to make things work differently, the post-school milieu is crucial to that. So having made that case, which is a motivator to all of us, because it's what we do every day, and it's basically saying you really can make a difference, then we delve a bit deeper and look at the socioeconomic status and their higher education access and success. Success in this case is measured predominantly around graduation, whereas you will remember that Raj Chetty, an American academic from Harvard, gave the keynote address at the Achieving the Dream conference, And for him, success was labor market success, because they have the data that can trace students all the way from where they come from into the institutions, out of the institutions, and into the labor market. We're aspiring to be able to do that in our country, and we've got some preliminary evidence that we'll present in number 4. And then we wrap up with some concluding discussions. But the point of today's discussion is, the point of today's presentation then is that we can engage. And so please, as we go, put any comments, put a flag in the chat that you'd like to come back to an issue. Nicola and Emma will respond as we go. And then after the concluding comments, we'll come back to an engagement. Thanks, if I leave any time for that. So the texture of our income inequality and our immobility, just 2 slides. This first slide locates, it has a particular view on South African inequality. Often when we talk about our inequality, we talk about our world-beatingly high Gini coefficient, which is the highest in the world. But that doesn't actually bring things home to, in terms of, okay, but what does this mean for all of us and building a better society in our country? So the slide we're presenting here looks at the share of income, total income, that goes to the top 10% of the South African income distribution. And it locates that in an international context, which is the context of Thomas Piketty's work, which is predominantly the developed country context, the USA, France, Germany. They were the key parts of Piketty's story, because they differ somewhat. But the levels of their top income shares that they were talking about, we have them here on the graph. And so, for example, the Thomas Piketty's case is that the US, the increase in inequality in the US, one of his stellar graphs, if you like, was this rising share of the top 10% in the US of the national income, up to close to 50%. Well, as you can see here. And so, and in his story, that was a crucial part of his story, that the more affluent are just getting more and more of the resources, and they can put them to use for their own children, to get ahead, for their own investments, their own savings, etc., and how that distorts and generates his famous equation where inequality produces inequality. So where does South Africa sit? Well, we're way above that. And we have been for a long, long time. So the graph starts at 1980, and it shows that in 1980, the share of total income that went to the top 10% of the income distribution was about 48%, and this traces the pattern over time. And you can see it rising quite dramatically over the post-apartheid period. And the reason why we chose this graph rather than some other graph to show that South African inequality is extremely high and always has been over the duration of the post-apartheid period, and has a long historical legacy that generated that, but has accelerated over the post-apartheid period. The reason we focus on that is because look at the share here. So it's above 60%. This is using Thomas Piketty's national accounts adjusted estimates. Our own work with survey data is slightly lower, but it's nudging 60%. So there's just no denying the fact that the top 10% of South Africa's income distribution takes more than half of our income and has that to work with, which means by default, and the focus of our discussion today, is that the rest of the distribution has what's left to work with in achieving their dreams, in paying for better schooling, if that's what it takes, in paying for better health care, in investing in your children. And that's not a productive society. It's an extremely unproductive milieu within which higher education institutions are inserted, because for many, many of our students, it's been a battle all the way through, and cumulative battles around, and to get learners into our higher education institutions. And that itself is an amazing triumph. So that's a very important context about that's why inequality is so important to us in the country, but in particular to us in our higher education institutions, particularly as we're moving towards models in which there's co-funding, or some of your higher education has to be funded from your own income. So what are the consequences of this? That's a slide that we produced from the National Income Dynamics Study that looks at the son's intergenerational earnings elasticity by earnings quantile. That's a mouthful. And we had a joke about that at this Siyaphumelela conference, because you're interested in what it means. But, if you want to throw it around at a cocktail party or something, and your creds in the inequality world, that's fine. What it really means, the intergenerational earnings elasticity by earnings quantile means as follows. On the bottom is the earnings quantile of your father or your mother. So 5 here is your father or your mother is at the lowest 5% of the earnings distribution in our country. And 95, you're at the top 95% as parents. So if you take that picture that we showed you before about the relative distribution of income and what we have to work with, what is the outcome that we see in the labor market for sons of such parents? So those at the bottom 5%, the intergenerational earnings elasticity is what is the probability that your son will be in the same lowest 5% of the earnings distribution as you, as a father and a mother who's trying hard to make things work for your children? Well, it's a devastating above 90% for both fathers and mothers. And that is just off the charts high. So you've got above 90% chance of also being in the lowest 5% if your parents are there in the labor market. That's the consequences of this inequality playing itself out. And it's devastating as a reflection on our society. It's intergenerational failure, completely. On the other hand, if you move to the other end, which would then be the transmission of advantage, if you're at the top 95th percentile, what's the probability of your son being there too? And it looks quite like it's fallen quite dramatically, but it's above 60%. So it's above 60% here, marginally different for fathers and mothers, but nonetheless, very strong transmission of advantage. And you can understand why, given the previous slide. You've got lots of income to work with your children. And then at the bottom, very strong transmission of disadvantage. And all the way through, actually, this is still extremely high. The big debates in the US that Rose Chetty was talking about the American dream and whether it's a fallacy, whether it's real, all play out around levels of intergenerational mobility of 0.45 and above. 0.5. 0.5 is considered a huge failure, indictment of the American dream. It's a fraud. That's how the debate has gone in the US. And here we sit in South Africa with this extreme immobility. So that's the consequence, that's the context. Now, how do we locate post-school attainment within the story? We start with a slide of what's called returns to years of schooling by schooling groups. And we've broken it up, and our focus is particularly on the fact that the South African story, as it's played out over the post-apartheid period, has been one with high and rising returns to 12 plus years of schooling, especially post-secondary. And that, it's not just high and rising, but relative to others. And actually, Nicola and Emma have updated this since Siyaphumelela. They've taken it even further to 2019 now, with more recent data that we have. But look, compare the pathways of incomplete secondary. So so there's a 20% rate of return, as economists would put it. Average returns to schooling are 20% if you've got less than complete secondary, incomplete secondary, and it's plummeted dramatically. And we know the story. This is quite well known and quite a well-established fact, but just look at the reality here. The declining returns that you get to incomplete secondary, and as well for primary, which were always very low. And that's a reflection of our labor market and what it's demanding. But it's also pretty daunting to note that even though we've made great strides in terms of access to schooling and increased average years of schooling in South Africa quite dramatically, from about complete primary in 1994, just below, to about just over 10 years of schooling on average now in contemporary South Africa. So this is a zone that most South African learners are in. They don't even get to post-matric, post-schooling. On the other hand, complete matric has always had a much higher return than incomplete in the labor market, but it has been declining recently. And one of the reasons to update the data was to illustrate this point, that completing matric itself is much, much better than not completing matric, but it's much inferior in the contemporary labor market to any post-matric returns. And so you're at the cusp of something really important in our country. Yeah. Here's another way of representing that. It's just to give you a picture of some different probabilities of employment by different years of schooling. And, you know, obviously the big debates in the country are about how do we link. One of the hugest issues we confront is how do we improve employment in the country? And this is just a reflection of the current situation, where you can see that less than grade 12, the probability of employment it's not zero, as is the discourse in the country often. And we slam our youth with that, but it's much lower than having a certificate or diploma. Well, it's about the same as having a certificate or diploma, but no grade 12. There's a rise with grade 12, but one that's declined recently. Any post-secondary certificate or diploma has a huge return in the labor market. And national training, a post-secondary qualification certificate has an additional return, and then a much higher return for a degree. And to make that, so that's the probability of employment, just getting a job. If you have a job, your earnings are fundamentally influenced by your years of schooling too. And this graph, it's much more dramatic even than the probability of employment. You compare the bottom, less than grade 12, average earnings are per month in rands, 3,000 rand, which is below the minimum wage, by the way, in South Africa. The minimum wage is close to 4,000 rand right now. It started out at 3,500 rand. And if you have a degree, though, it's 21,000 rand per month in rands. So that's dramatically different. It's 7 times, effectively. So, key point for us in both of these slides that we've shown is the crucial role that our university institutions are playing in helping our society, in helping our people get ahead and forge a life and turn around this intergenerational mobility. It's right now, given the labor market, there seems to be no other way of turning around our story in the country. At the same time, although each of our institutions, one of the things we learned from the Siyaphumelela conference is that each of our institutions have taken on increasing numbers of students into their institutions, and but at a national level, at a systemic level, that hasn't kept up yet with the youth bulge that's been coming through, demanding access to our tertiary institutions. And some of them never get to the tertiary institutions because of the education failures that we've spoken about earlier. But nonetheless, at a systemic level, if you look at the qualifications attained from 1994 to 2003, it's pretty flat, actually, as a percentage of a growing youth population. Now, that has been the youth bulge that's hit our institutions exactly now, going through. And the youth bulge is moving through into the labor market. And so the pressure will taper somewhat. But nonetheless, right now, if you look at the system, so any qualification, 12% of the relevant youth age group, which was 25 to 34. So it's old enough so that youth can have completed their schooling to 34. And if you trace it through, it's been 12%, and it rose somewhat of any qualification, but to about 14%. And here we've got an aspirational goal that comes out of the National Development Plan, really, as to what we were aspiring and what we thought we needed in order to breathe some dynamism into our society. These are the diplomas, bachelor's or higher, and it's even more daunting because it's flat, effectively flat over the period. So as I said before, the percentage of youth coming into our institutions has increased. The numbers of youth coming into our institutions have increased, and so we've all been taking some strain in accommodating that. But systemically, this is a picture of our lack of aggregate progress in terms of raising the percentage of youth with post-secondary qualifications. This comes off the Siyaphumelela interactive website. So, yeah, I must remember to get my slides working properly. So no change in the share of youth with diploma, bachelor, or higher qualifications since 1994. That's the big picture that we confront. If we then look at the qualifications attainment by subgroup, it's even a bit more sobering. Subgroup by subgroup, here we mean racial subgroup. And basically, you can see that average, the average is replicated here that we had on our previous graph. And you can see that for African and colored youth, 25 to 34-year-old youth, they've been consistently below and have risen somewhat towards the average. And obviously they drive, that's the majority of the population, that's 90% plus of our population. So that's going to drive the average itself. But we are interested in changing the social mobility that transforms our society and broadens access, but also changes the historical overlay of our inequalities, is also part of our social agenda. And so what you see here is that qualification attainment by subgroup has risen quite strongly for white South Africans and for Indian, Asian groups, but especially for white. And the gap between African and white youth has actually widened. That's the gap from the average, 25% there. Well, that's the gap between the whites and the African group, and it's risen to 33% as a share achieving these qualifications. So that's, again, the lack of social mobility. The only way you transform this picture is to transform the social mobility, actually, in our society. Transform who's getting ahead and who's falling behind. And one doesn't want the white group to not get ahead and to contribute productively to our society. But it's crucial, given our inequality and given that 90% of our population are not white, that this is not a sustainable basis for a society to get ahead. That's the key point we're making. That's a very uneven picture, though. Often averages lie, and it's very important that we don't get all depressed and give up our game. The whole point of this presentation really is to show that we are making a difference and we can do even better. And so that average, one of the ways of showing this is just to show that there's been differential experience across the country, spatially. So overall, there's no change in youth attainment since 1994, but that masks differences across provinces. And there's some surprises here. So, for example, surprises to us. The Free State and Northwest provinces have seen the largest growth in percentage of youth with these post-secondary qualifications. Gauteng and the Western Cape are also moving ahead, which means they're pulling ahead more higher, because you can see they've got higher percentages. That's on the bottom axis here. There you can see where they started. And then the arrow reflects their progress. And you can see that the Free State and Northwest started quite low percentages, and have made some progress. And this is crucial. You've got to understand where you're starting from in your own institutions, in your own provinces, because that's your context for making a difference. And then some have fallen behind. Limpopo, KZN, Northern Cape have fallen behind. So we wanted to make the key point that, you know, those of you that have really been giving your all in the trenches over the last 30 years, you have made a difference. That's not the point of this presentation, is to undermine that. The present point of the presentation is to give the context. Oh, sorry. Have I gone all dark? If I don't move, my lights go off. Let me wave around a bit here. Okay, sorry about that. So let's delve some deeper now into student SES and look a bit closer at the students coming into our institutions and their higher education access and their success. So how are we going to do this? Or how have we done this? How have we attempted to bring this picture to you? We're obviously in the HEMIS data. We've got very comprehensive system-wide university data. And we know where applicants come from. It's in each institution knows where people are applying from. It's in their application process. You know, so you know if you're the University of Cape Town, who's applying from Eastern Cape or KwaZulu-Natal. But what we don't have in our HEMIS system is, okay, but what is the socioeconomic information about the area from which people are applying? what is this, the socioeconomic status of that area. And there is obviously we spend a lot of our time with our normal poverty and inequality work, looking at those sorts of spatial inequalities and the spatial distribution of poverty. And so what we can do here is match student postal codes, the postal codes from which they apply, to average community income information from the 2011 census. And we can divide the population of students entering into institutions. So we can, so we've got students entering institutions. We know from the census data the income from the postal code from which they were applying, and we can consider that the distribution of entering students, and we can then divide those entering students in 2015 from the HEMIS data into 5 equal income categories. So the bottom 20%, then the next 20%, that takes then that takes you to 40%, the next takes you to 60, 80, and 100, etc. Where the top 20% are the best students applying from the best off postal codes in income terms, and the bottom 20% are students applying from the poorest postal codes. So there's a crucial caveat here that we need to note. We're assuming that the students' socioeconomic circumstances are well represented by the average of their postal code. And obviously, that's probably not right, because if you've got your matric, you're probably at the top end of your postal code's income distribution anyway. So there's some problem with that, but the gaps are so glaring at these average levels that that's hardly a dramatic indictment of what we're doing here. I think it's still quite telling. So we classify students from the bottom 1 to 3, so the bottom 60% of the income of students applying in 2015 as lower income, for just to make our analysis more tractable. Yeah. So when we talk about lower income, that's the bottom 60% of the income distribution of incoming students, and that's okay, because as you may or may not know, Statistics South Africa estimates 55% of our population to be below the poverty line. So we're not classifying not poor students as lower income. That's not how our inequality in our country works, as you've seen. Okay, so now here's the map that just maps out student SES, the SES of applying students in 2015 using postal codes. And the very dark is quintile 5. That's the best off 20% of applying students. And the very light is quintile 1. That's the poorest 20%. And the white means that there were no applying students from those postal codes. That's why we don't have data on them in the system. And, you know, just a broad brush, this looks like every other spatial map we've drawn of well-being in the country, where this is the Eastern Cape and the old Bantustan areas continue to be like the most disadvantaged areas. But don't forget that this graph is now anchored at students applying for tertiary institutions. And it's the distribution of those students around the country. Let me so the very dark, as I said, is quintile 5, and just to anchor that, so 27% of all students from the quintile 5 postal codes, of the top 20%, 27% of those are from these 3 spatial areas: Johannesburg, Sandton, and Randburg. And that's not the broader definition of the Joburg Metro. These are very, very narrow postal codes, right? That's what they are. They're postal codes, don't forget. So there's a more than much more than 20% of the top 20% are coming from those 3 postal codes. And so that's quite interesting, and it gives you some sense of our inequalities again. But what's more interesting, obviously you want to anchor that back to your institutions. In some institutions, the share of students is low. So what have we done here? So here we've got lower income access. Remember, that's the bottom 60% of applying students by institution. And so you've got the institutions listed at the bottom here. Hopefully you can see the graph. We worked hard to make it a little bit more visible than it was at Siyaphumelela, but it's hard to do and include all the institutions. But we've got the institutions listed here: Stellenbosch, Venda, Walter Sisulu, and then here we've got the share of students from quintile 1 to 3 postal code. So this has got a sum, the share of students who apply to that institution are from those quintiles. And so you can see the University of Venda, 89% of their students come from those postal codes that apply to get into the University of Venda, come from those postal codes. 88% from Walter Sisulu, from Mpumalanga, the University of Mpumalanga, 85. And then at the bottom, the more what are called the traditional institutions in the DHET categorizations, you can see that 4% of students applying to Stellenbosch in 2015 were from those postal codes. 20% at the University of Cape Town, 33% at the University of Pretoria. So you can check out your institution and see where that sits. We drew a line here at 0.6. Why did we do that? Well, because don't forget we've classified 60% of applying students as lower income. So if you were proportionate, you would take in 60% of lower. If everything was even in our society, and our society was just working in a very neutral way, each institution would take 60% of the 60% of the lowest income students. That would just be proportionate. And so that gives you some sense of where one sits. But there's many, this needs to be interpreted with nuance, and I'm sure you're going to want to come back to this in the engagement afterwards. In some institutions, the share of students is low, but they represent a large number of students coming from lower income backgrounds. Thus, there's still potential for social mobility. You know, these numbers need to be interpreted with care, and that's why on this slide, we actually give you raw numbers. That's the numbers of students from these applying from low income access in the institutions. And so you can see, for example, that, well, I think I was given a bullet to explain this. So 33% of University of Pretoria students come from lower income postal codes. That's lower than the 0.6, that would be neutral. But this is almost 3,000 students. So that's similar to the University of Venda, which has the highest share here at 90%. But that's 3,000 students as well. So these figures need reflection in your own institutional context to work out, okay, well, what does this mean? And this is a systemic picture in the country, and it means that we even institutions that are taking in a much lower share right now, there's still a substantial number of students. So this enterprise that we're on with Siyaphumelela and improving access, and in particular improving access for students who come into our institutions from disadvantaged backgrounds, it's all of our jobs, and we've all got a contribution to make. Yeah. But it is quite interesting also to note, okay, who right now is taking in most of those students? And I'm sure that requires its own strategies. And that's something for Siyaphumelela to think about as well. So here we contrived to some extent these lower students applying from lower income quintiles, and their shares. So as you go up here, you go from 20%, which you remember was where UCT was, Stellenbosch was below that, to 100%, and you get a vendor being close to at 90%. So that's the share. And then Chetty here showed labor market outcomes on his graph, but we can't do that in South Africa yet as his outcome. So we show we think it's a very particularly important outcome, the share graduating on time, quintiles 1 to 3 from these quintile 1 to 3 postal codes. So these are the lower income students. What are the shares graduating on time in their postal codes? And somewhat surprisingly, that you get we use the HEMIS data from 2015 to 2020. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to track these 2015 students through to graduation. So we had to use, and we're able to use HEMIS data later on to track their progress through the universities. For us, the positive slope at first blush anyway was something of a surprise, because it's as you all know, it's quite a challenge to work with students coming from these disadvantaged backgrounds and help the students to achieve success in universities on time. So graduation on time means 3-year degree, they graduate in 3 years. Well, you know much more about that than I do, exactly what graduation on time means. But it is quite amazing that the highest on-time graduations do correlate somewhat positively with the highest percentage taking in those graduates. So you could think, okay, but that's why that was somewhat surprising is because that's not, I don't know if that's exactly what you would have expected, but it's, I think that the university taking the bulk of these incoming students do have challenges. So that's it's a very interesting picture, I think, for us to reflect on. But much more important, I think, is to reflect on your own institutions, because this is our attempt to give this discussion something of an institutional flavor, where you can look at your institution and say, okay, here's some assessment of our progress in this mission of ours. And you can see a lot of, there's a lot of lines above and below the line. And obviously, if you're above the line, it means you're doing marginally better than the fitted. This is the fitted trend. So if you're above the line, you're doing somewhat better than the fitted trend. And if you're below the line, you're doing somewhat worse, no matter what quintile, whether you were taking in 60% of your students. If you're above the line, you're still doing better than others at 60%. So it gives you some sort of benchmark as to where you sit. And you can see that there's lots of room for thought here and room for reflection on, okay, but what's going on here? And you can see, just allow me to draw your attention to UNISA here, which takes a huge number of students, as we know. And so this situation is tricky for us all, even systemically. But most of the slide is about us think about your institutions and where you sit. Sorry, you know, this is, yeah, anyway, I don't know if you heard the train going past. But anyway, so that's urging us that the train's on the track. These students are trying to succeed. Let's go. Now, obviously, graduating on time is what the department is very focused on, because, but it's not the only measure of success. You know, most of our strategies are designed to work with students coming from exactly these backgrounds, and it takes a lot of hard work, and graduation is a huge success. We work hard at this thing, and we work with our students to get them to graduate. And often the first year in a university is a huge time of adjustment for exactly these sorts of students, and exactly the time that Siyaphumelela interventions seek to intervene to make this process work better for students. And so what we did on this graph is we reproduced what we had before. This is the graduation on time. And so it's exactly the same graph as you had before. It's a bit squished up because in the middle here, we've then got those graduating in N+1. So 1 extra year, but then they do graduate out of the institution. And then here we've got N+2. So graduating in 2 years, extra time. And so you can see that there's a lot of progress. There was the surprising results, but something that's worth celebrating from these institutions that take in a large share of these students a large share of their students are from poorer backgrounds, and they graduate many on time. Obviously, if you're doing that, then the room for progress is also dampened. So in graduating, but nonetheless, you can see quite substantial progress for those that are doing well in the first place in N+1. And then but then of course that you can only graduate 100% of your incoming students. And so that then tops out here at the top. And you can see some of these other institutions that were below the line, like the UZ here. You can see it makes quite some, if you move to N+1, the progress is a lot better. And then you can trace it all the way through. So once again, have a look at your own institutions, and you can see that particularly for some of these, what we pointed out earlier were low percentage of their incoming students are from these disadvantaged backgrounds. But nonetheless, that's quite a lot of students in some cases. The University of Pretoria was the example. So there's great progress then in moving from, if you look at N+1, this progress here is really worth focusing on and saying, okay, maybe we played our role in that. Maybe Siyaphumelela 1 and Siyaphumelela 2 had something to do with this. And it does give you quite a nuanced view of your institution. And progress is even more if you go to N+2. So as we know, many of our strategies are designed around getting students to graduate, and we're quite happy. Each university has its own rules about when you progress to the next level and when you're allowed to continue, and they do try and accommodate the fact that that progress is very hard in the initial years. These platform years are so crucial, and we work so hard at them. But we consider these graduations to be huge triumphs, don't we? I mean, really, we do. And this raises a very interesting policy dilemma, actually, for this enterprise of ours, and for DHET, of course, because DHET, because of budget restrictions and things, DHET and our NSFAS funding, etc., DHET are very reticent to fund students who are falling behind. and so there's been a pushback, and DHET are pushing back to fund students for on-time graduation. And the funding formulas have been changing away from providing support for these type of students. But nonetheless, of course, that's not to say that DHET's not interested in graduation as the ultimate success. And so this does raise a real policy dilemma that's worth exploring, because this then, what this is doing is, this is a success, as I said before. We all of us on this call, anyway, all of us as part of the Siyaphumelela network would regard these graduations as great successes. We celebrate them hugely, but they're becoming, as DHET changes its funding formula, the cost of pushing on to achieve the success is being pushed to the universities. So that's quite an important factor, I'm sure, for all of you when you're thinking about this. And I think it's quite an important systemic policy issue, because these graduations are so important. One of the so then in moving on to closure now, one of the important factors undergirding this here, of course, is a discussion about the quality of what's being done in the institutions, and so how hard it is to graduate also depends upon what you're demanding of students, and whether you're giving your students the skills that are required in the labor market. So we saw earlier on at the big picture level that the higher education institutions, that graduates from higher education institutions are doing quite well in the labor market, and we'll show you that again now. That is a stylized fact. They're doing extremely well. Remember that share of the probability of being employed was above 90% for any university, and that's the average probability. But as soon as one moves to a more tailored view of what you're doing in your institutions, and you're pushing people to graduate, but you're also pushing people to assisting people to graduate and assisting people to go into the labor market and to flourish. That's why Rose Chetty focused on employment. And it's why institutions are focusing on improving the quality of their offerings. So then let's move then very briefly, because we don't have much to say about that, to what we have to say about labor market outcomes of the graduates. So now we are focusing on these graduates, and we're looking at the percentage that was employed in 2017, just to make the point that that outcome that we showed earlier, that more than 90% of graduates from universities are employed. The probability of employment is above 90%. That's precisely what we showed earlier. That's again a story that differs across institutions, and there's room for all of us to make progress here in terms of a better linking between graduating with what exactly, and empowered to do what. And it's a nuanced story. And this slide uses data that Rose Chetty has at his fingertips. It uses data from the tax system in South Africa, income tax data that was made available to the HSRC, as you can see at the bottom, and to Mike Rogan from the University from Rhodes, to look at 2015 NSFAS graduates. So they graduated in 2015. You picked them up and they were funded by NSFAS. So it's not exactly our lowest 60%, but so these were NSFAS students, and their percentage that were employed in 2017. In the tax data, you can trace these students over time. They're no longer students. They're out there. They're in the labor market. The tax data, given the high percentage of university graduates that are in the formal sector of the labor market, you can pick them up in the tax data, as we've shown here, as this study showed. And you track them, and so you look at the percentage that were employed in 2017, and it gives you a variegated picture. And it's, you know, obviously there's a lot of subtlety here, because some students may have graduated and then taken time out to start a family or whatever. You know, it's a complicated stepping stone out of these institutions into the labor market. Some of them may be in graduate studies, etc., which is a success in another sense. So, but nonetheless, I do think this is a very interesting graph, and you can see that it differs quite remarkably by institution. And so one of the margins that each institution will want to focus on is the achievements of their students once they graduate. That is the ultimate outcome measure, ultimate success, if you like. And that's why Ross-Chetty focused solely on that, not on graduation rates, but on the labor market as the measure of success. But nonetheless, you can see differences across institutions. You can engage with your own institution on that. And I think this links back, one point on this. I think this does link back to that previous slide. Let me see if I can get back there, where you can see that it's taking some institutions longer to get their students from quintiles 1 to 3 postal codes to graduate. It's taking them longer. But once they're in the labor market, they're doing pretty well. They really are succeeding. And so that sharpens this contrast that I was drawing between the funding pressures on DHET and us in the trenches supporting students to achieve graduation as the ultimate success. And often that takes more than on time. And it's still a success, and it's still important for our country, but we're being asked to bear the burden of the costs of that. So I think that's quite a profound policy point. And that's really where we end our presentation here, saying that this then feeds back into our strategies to do better on our social mobility and to reduce our inequality. Obviously, those strategies at the higher education level, that starts very late. We pick up this cumulative disadvantage very late in the system, but nonetheless, it's quite important to integrate our thinking into what is the policy vision in the country. What are the policies on, you know, that are under operation and under implementation, and how can we integrate better with those policies? And so obviously the key prongs of the policy approach and the key prongs that focus on progress through school, and then also supporting students through into the universities where we pick them up. Anyway, this slide was a bit of an advertorial for the type of work that Soldier is doing on a few aspects of these policies, and we're a very proud part of Siyaphumelela here. And so improving higher education comes quite late. I think that's there's bedrock policies or social, boy, sorry about that, bit of hand waving. That must look bizarre for you guys. There's the social platform that it's government's responsibility to provide, and is so crucial as the sort of platform within which we can all do our thing. But then there's also the progress through school and productivity and health, and building a healthy and productive citizenry that then comes into our higher education institutions. And then there's us. And so I'm gonna stop here. I just wanted to end off with an exhortation, really, a heartfelt exhortation that, okay, so we come here and we're picking up a situation that hasn't been working very, very well to feed students into our institutions that have the background and the socioeconomic situation that we can focus on doing what we need to do entirely. We need to do that plus. But we've also shown in this presentation what a crucial role we have to play every day. Each one of us in our own way, you know, whether it's at the first year level, whether it's all the way through each student, student by student, we're absolutely key to all of this. So I'm going to stop there, actually, and then we can take it up as the chair wants to. And I think Nicola and Emma also have some inputs if we need it. I see quite a lot of comments in the chat. Anyway, back to you, Chair.
Great. Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Prof, for that. So we've got a bit of time now for discussion and discussion around the data and what it is that Siyaphumelela should be doing next. Does anybody have any questions or anything you'd like to add? Welcome to just raise your hands.
Murray, could you maybe just switch through to the next couple of slides, because it might also help with yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so actually I was supposed to talk to this slide, but anyway, Nicola, do you just want to do it?
So we thought, so Ashton actually asked us if we could just sort of come up with a couple of thoughts about what the framework that we presented might give us for thinking as a collective about what institutions can do to sort of catalyze social mobility. And so, as it says, the framework suggests that you can improve lower income access at institutions, especially institutions which have good labor market outcomes. You can improve outcomes of lower income students in institutions where, again, we have thinking back onto the labor market in terms of employment and earnings. And then you can improve outcomes of students at institutions serving this large share. So all of these kind of approaches would then catalyze students into positions, hopefully towards the top end of the income distribution. Do you want to switch to the next slide, Mary? So we wanted to pause and ask you questions, but we also came up with maybe a couple that can facilitate some questions from your side. I don't know if there are any questions at this point before I go through these. Okay, so I mean, it feels like the sort of starting point with the framework, and it's something that Raj Chetty does in his presentation at Achieving Dream, is to really sort of say, well, it's interesting and maybe important to reflect on where on that sort of mapping of access and success your institution lies. But also, I think in South Africa, with so much change, to think about how have circumstances changed over time. Do you know what progress has been made and where you want to end up? And I imagine that those are answers, within the institution, there's probably a rich amount of information on that. So we're really thinking of this framework as just a kind of way of consolidating all that knowledge and thinking through how that might translate into this sort of social mobility story. Sort of where is the largest mobility contribution that your institution could make? That's another question we thought could be asked. And are your graduates achieving the income mobility that we hope for? And so some of these require access to information. Some of them, it might be information or data that's already being gathered in your institution. So really just thinking of this as a framework that can then be used to gather the information and know where your institution is at. So I don't know if those spark some questions.
You are welcome to raise your hand and unmute yourselves. I'm just thinking in terms of how have the circumstances changed over time. What we've seen with the Siyaphumelela data is how the percentage of NSFAS funding has changed dramatically within the institutions. And I know your data is using the pre-fees must fall NSFAS data. So I was just wondering how we think that might have changed over time if we've got the more recent data. Well, how we think the more recent data might look. And to add, within Siyaphumelela, we do focus a lot on the NSFAS funded because institutions are collecting that data. And to add, we've seen the retention rates for NSFAS is good, but it's the throughput in the N+1, the N+2, where institutions are sitting. But we imagine that the changes in the NSFAS policy as well around their funding might have a lot of implications for the universities.
Yeah, and I think that you're raising a really important point. If we go back to the slide looking at N+1, N+2, and the graduation rates, as you mentioned, there've been changes in both the share of students that are funded by NSFAS that are enrolling, and then there are also changes in the policy regarding how much time you have, or how much funded time you have. So in the sort of old NSFAS policy, it used to be N+2. Then that was removed, and I think at the moment it's N+1. So what's the implication of that then in terms of your student body and your graduation rates? So one of the things that we're thinking about this framework, again, highlights is that you might get a student that is likely to graduate and has already had a lot of investment from the institution and from funding, and then loses funding at sort of the end of N+1. So policies then as Murray said, like that then rests on the institution, which might they might not be able to deal with it. So things like that, knowing which of your students are in that position, knowing which of the students are so close to graduating but not necessarily there yet. I've heard partnering with UNISA can be a way to get students to graduate, but the overall point being that in terms of social mobility in particular, like getting them to that point of graduation is so important, obviously, as you all know.
Ashley, can I add in?
Go for it.
Yeah, and whilst I really do want to, exactly, so there's a comment in the chat right now that says, this will be a challenge as many students only complete in N+2. Gavin, that's exactly right. And I was trying to emphasize that within our Siyaphumelela community, that, you know, that's a success. And so these issues that you're talking about are like systemic issues that have quite a big consequence. And I would like, it would be very nice if somebody could talk to the type of pressures that they felt, or maybe they're not feeling it right now in Siyaphumelela right now, but it's going to come back into these programs if universities are being put under pressure around these graduation rates. And I just wanted to make a point that that the president of Georgia State, when he visited, you know, he's one of they're like achieving the dream darling, or I don't know what to call them, but they've been incredibly thoughtful and evidence-based and implemented some really important things. And one of the comments that the president made was that they had pressure to stop supporting and stop funding their students who were somewhat behind in graduation. And what they did as an institution was to look at these students and look at, okay, but what is the probability of success? In other words, to grapple with the problem and try and look for some evidence on this particular issue. And they found that, look, if the students had stayed on track through the normal university rules, like if you're not passing any of your courses in first year, that's not a good sign. But the universities have got quite nuanced progression rules. They just don't mesh with the funding rules. And they worked out that the probability of those students that had hung in there and were within a year of graduating, even if they were late, the probability of them graduating was extremely high. And basically, what they did was that they underwrote the students. They gave them all funding in order to allow them to graduate. And he I can't remember his name, Mark somebody, do you remember? Mark Becker, maybe. He said it was one of the best investments we ever made. It was a complete win because they did then get, on graduation, they did then get something from some funding, because they're a state-run university. So, and maybe that's one of the things that we could look for in South Africa, that we pressurize the DHET to fund, to keep some funding for graduation, even if they're going to stop, if they're going to be more strict on getting through the system quickly, they're going to also give some funding for successful graduation, because he said it was a hugely successful investment. But there are 2 points here. One, you can look at your own track record, and that's part of what Siyaphumelela does, right? We've got a really, really good sense of progress through over the long run. You know, and then two, we could insert that point about, okay, but some subsidy must come back to universities just for graduation. That allows us to do this sort of thing. Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Does anybody wish to add to that? I think, Prof, you asked the pressure that universities are under in order to get their students to graduate. Does anyone want to comment?
Ashton, Gavin McGregor here from a non-profit, Umthombo Youth Development Foundation. I think we're on the right track by using data, because NSFAS, DHET, everybody wants to support students who are going to succeed. We don't want to waste money on students who are going to fail. So the more data we have in terms of tracking whether they will be successful after first year or second year, because students who are going to fall out of the system hopefully should fall out early, so money's not wasted on them. And I think, you know, NSFAS, it's a knee-jerk reaction of reducing N+2 to N+1, it's not done on analyzing data, but they can't afford to pay for students to stay in the system too long. So it's a message: get in, get out, which we all want, but we have to support them, come in early and support students to succeed so that ultimately they can finish in N or N+1. So the only way we can do that is measuring data and providing support early in the system. That's my comments.
And I will add to that it's also about then having the data around what are the interventions that the institutions are doing that are having the greatest benefit on the students in terms of getting them to pass. So what are those evidence-based student success practices, and how can we scale those across the institution and across the sector? Yes, we've got a hand up. You're welcome to ask.
Hi, everyone. So this is Hannah. So I think I have two comments. So number one, I definitely agree with what Gavin has said, especially around the pressures, not only on funding from government, but then also just students feeling that pressure in terms of understanding the fact that they need to finish and get out of the system as quickly as possible, and what impact I think that has on the students as well, because I feel as if that also has an impact on whether or not they make it out to some extent, especially in that final year. So we work with students, and the number of students who come to us at the beginning of the year, of their final year, who are feeling the pressure of not only needing to leave the system because they've been informed that their funding is going to end, that always has a really negative impact on students sometimes. So that's the first comment. I think the second comment I had is around the employability of students once they've graduated. So we were in a meeting where they spoke about, at some point, it looks as if students are just leaving the system, but leaving with not even a first or a second class degree. Students are leaving with just a third class degree, and what impact that has on their employability once they leave the system. So I don't know, is that something we could look at in terms of what kind of degree did the student leave the system with? And did that have an impact on the type of job or employment that they got when they left the system? Yeah, so I think that's really, that's my quick point and question on this.
Thanks, Hannah. Is that question directed? I think that's a question broadly to the audience, but just I think it's a really important point. And Murray, would you mind switching through to the last slide that we haven't yet shown? Sorry. So I think there is just one, yeah. Yeah, so I think you're really bringing the story back to the full cycle into employment, and I think that that's really important, and it does come down to data. And one of the things Ashton also asked us to do was think about, like, what additional data can institutions be gathering that can then inform this sort of evidence-based approach. And so as far as if I'm looking at the HEMIS data, there's no information in there on the sort of class of degree that a student is getting. So maybe that's something to put on the agenda to really understand. I don't know if institutions, so with the sort of institutions have a lot more data than available in HEMIS, and I imagine they have that class of degree, and so you would be able to assess that at an institutional level.
Ashton, can I come in?
Yes, Prof.
I I thought that was exactly, that was a really excellent question, and I guess I've got two responses or excellent input actually. The first, I took us back to this slide here, and I think it's quite important because there's the sort of the scattering classes version of differences across institutions and employment, right? And to parody it, or to take it to an extreme, it's like, okay, but there are a bunch of universities in which the qualification is not worth the paper that it's written on. It's exactly the type of comment that's made of, you know, young people. They've just graduated with matric, they've just completed it, incredible struggle, and then everybody gets on the radio and slams them and says, okay, but that's nothing. And so you need to look at the data. You don't want to, you know, you don't want to give people false hope, or you don't want to, but look at the data, right? Look at the, in the context of the national policy discussion that's completely focused on, okay, we got to do STEM, it's STEM or nothing, which isn't a very helpful type of a discourse for universities making progress and doing what they do better. And if you look at these data, there is no institution that isn't doing substantially better than the labor market in placing its graduates in employment. They're just doing much better. That picture that I showed you earlier about the role of universities, there is differentiation within the picture, but it's a positive picture. And one mustn't let the policy dialogue run away from that, and just get focused on stuff that the labor market needs the following law. And so the rest of it's a waste of time, and it's a waste of money, and DHET needs to reconfigure its funding model. Well, you need to produce some data if you want to make those arguments, right? And so there is data, and there are differences in returns, but this is I'm just making the universities must be a bit more sort of positive about what they're doing. And so I think that's a very important point. But secondly, there is a lot to learn. And again, the Georgia State had an example. There's a lot to learn by feeding in, not just have career counseling for your graduating students where a bunch of companies pitch up on campus and interview some people. They actually integrated the labor market and labor market information and made it available to students, and put seminars on for the student body. And then even, you know, they actually did a much richer job of saying, okay, this is what is going on in the labor market, and this is what's happened to our students. They did want to know. They did start tracking their students into the labor market, and they started feeding evidence back to students, both about, okay, but this is how the labor market works. Don't wait till you've graduated to think about that. And two, this is what they used examples, and they used their own graduates to come back and talk to their own students about that linkage. And so they fed it back in a positive way, not excluding somebody who's studying social science from that discussion, that there weren't any boundaries on who was allowed to participate in that discussion about how the labor market was working. And it made for a much more nuanced and evidence-informed. The students changed themselves, not necessarily changed courses, but they knew how what they were doing fitted into after the university. And so that's again a type of intervention that I think one could think about. I don't think it's fair to ask universities to necessarily bear the burden of sketching the labor market situation and the labor market situation for their graduates, etc. But getting the system to produce such information and feed it back to the universities, I think could be very useful. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. When I look at this one, I can definitely see there's a spatial pattern to it. I mean, if you're looking at the 4 top ones, they're all based in the Western Cape. So it seems like it might not be so much the degree itself. It's about moving to an area where there is more job prospects. And that's where you say understanding the labor market.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so it would be very nice for somebody at Walter Sisulu to know, okay, so what does happen to our graduates? Because 62% of them were in employment 2 years later. Well, where? Doing what? You know, what is that reality? That's not something you think about when you know, after your graduation party. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it really just stresses the point that student success is more than just throughput and graduation. It's got to do what happens after graduation, and it puts then universities in the position where they need to be collecting that information. And that should be a priority in the next phase of Siyaphumelela as well. We were mentioning that the employability aspect, although it was strongly mentioned at the conference, has kind of dropped off our plans for Siyaphumelela 3.0. So we need to make sure that it comes back into it, and that universities are collecting the data that they need around it.
Yeah, and one of the things that Nicola and Emma and I were discussing a bit in preparation for today is that has to, you know, assembling and preparing those data, that mustn't come as an additional burden to people who are already working incredibly hard in Siyaphumelela on, you know, on day-to-day things. We need to configure that in a way that evidence can be produced and, you know, and packaged, and it's different. It clearly involves the university, the data people at large, writ large, the data, you know, the university's institutional data people. But that, you know, somehow they need to be connected with projects that produce these data for the institution. And so it's just, in other words, so it's not an additional burden. That's not, I don't think that's what we're trying to do in Siyaphumelela. We're trying to design stuff, you know, including useful contextual information about what students come into universities and what students do when they leave universities, without putting additional stress on people who are already having to work incredibly hard to get the N+2 success.
Okay, thanks very much. Have we got any further questions?
Ashton, can I add a point to Murray's, because I think he got cut off. So I think
I thought so.
yeah. So I mean, two of the ways that information on students' employment is usually gathered is either through a kind of graduate destination study or through these linkages that we see becoming more popular in some other countries, where you're linking, like this this one is linking SARS data, I mean, yeah, tax records with HEMIS records. And I think one thing we can think about from sort of the institution level side is what can be put in place to facilitate those data collections. So it's not necessarily something that the institution needs to do itself, but if we're thinking broadly about creating information systems that would allow us to gather this data, what would they be? So the things that come to mind for me are, with the graduate destination study, one of the big challenges you end up having is finding students once they've left. And so contact details while students are enrolled in the institution even like informing students that they could be part of a study, like once they leave the institution, to be contacted and answer questions, because response rates tend to be quite low on those kind of studies. So almost like within the institution, creating a kind of environment where students understand that giving that information back can then inform the system. So that's sort of a graduate destination study. And then the other one is obviously this linking to tax data will really require the institutions to, you know, if you have a national project, to get on board with that and agree to those kind of processes. So I think that's maybe what Murray was going to say, that this kind of could be done in sort of externally, but linking back into individual institutions and then providing the information rather than requiring institutions to do it themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, so to add, there could be possibility within the National Student Data Warehouse project being run by WITS. I think that is taking off again, where you would have one central system when it comes to student data. And there it will be with IDs, so you would be able to link it to other data sets such as the SARS data set, or and then feed that back into the institution. But maybe that's a 5-year dream.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it is something that to keep going, and the conversation's been going for a long time, and I realize that, but it does feel like such an important part of the whole system.
Yeah. And another external data set that could possibly be used is LinkedIn. They've made big promises as well to institutions around tracking their graduates, because they do sit with a lot of the graduate data and employability data.
Yeah, that would also be a great source of data.
Yeah, can I just add that, of course, I mentioned Mike Rogan from Rhodes earlier. So he has been doing these graduate tracer studies. He and Nicola have been doing them for a while now. And there is a lot of support in the system from USAF and from DHET to do it more in a better thought through and more systemic way for the whole system. So I think there's a lot to build off there, and there's some momentum already. So it's, you know, some of it might obviously the data warehouse is a useful resource, but to some extent it's also about connecting with things that are already on the go.
Great. Thanks very much, Prof. Any additional questions or comments from people? You've all been very quiet. Okay. But I just want to say thanks very much, Prof. Thanks, Nicola. Thanks, Emma, for all of your work that you've put into it. We're definitely going to use some of the questions and comments that you've made around your key points in terms of the discussion and get the Siyaphumelela institutions to engage a lot more thoroughly with that in the upcoming sessions. So for everybody who's wondering, yes, the recording will be made available as well as the presentation. There's also an article that's gone out on University World News. So I'll share that article link as well. And that email should probably go out tomorrow, and I'll send it to everybody who registered. So thanks very much, Murray. Thanks, Nicola, and thank you, Emma. This was a fantastic session, and I think people were able to engage with the slides a lot better, and also give people the opportunity to engage with it who weren't able to attend our conference. Great. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.